What's happening? I don't know. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's happening. We're losing control of the airplane. We completely lost control of the airplane, and we don't understand anything. We tried everything. What you are hearing are the initial moments of a puzzle that would become one of modern aviation's most profound mysteries. How could a premier aircraft, guided by a highly experienced crew, suddenly plummet into the vast, dark unknown? This is the narrative of Air France Flight 447. The flight's final journey began on the evening of May 31st, 2009, but the emergency that sealed its fate would unfold in the early hours of June 1st. At 22:29 local time, Air France Flight 447 initiated its departure, pushing back from the gate at Brazil's Rio de Janeiro International Airport. Its destination was Paris, France. The flight path from Rio to Paris charts a course directly over the Atlantic Ocean. Originating in Brazil, it arcs across the northern Atlantic, making its approach to the European mainland before its scheduled landing in Paris. This transcontinental flight normally has a duration of around 12 hours. The airplane for this journey was an Airbus A330-200, which was the most recently delivered Airbus A330 to the Air France fleet at the time. It had just completed a significant maintenance overhaul in April of 2009 and had logged approximately 19,000 flight hours by the time of the incident. Powering the jet were two General Electric CF6 engines, which had no history of documented problems. On board were 216 passengers hailing from close to 30 different nations. The largest groups of passengers were citizens of France, Brazil, and Germany. While this type of aircraft is engineered to be flown by two pilots, the long-haul duty period for the Rio to Paris sector required an augmented crew to comply with regulations regarding flight time and rest periods. This is in accordance with Air France's own operational procedures. The concept of duty time encompasses not just the flight itself, but also all pre-flight preparations. To remain in compliance, Flight 447 was therefore staffed with a three-pilot crew. The captain was 58-year-old Marc Dubois. He was a veteran with nearly 11,000 hours of flight time, over 6,000 of which were as captain, including 1,700 hours specifically on the Airbus A330. The relief first officer, who would occupy the left seat as co-pilot, was 37-year-old David Robert. He had logged more than 6,000 flight hours, with an impressive 4,500 of those on this particular aircraft model. And the first officer, serving as the co-pilot in the right seat, was 32-year-old Pierre-Cedric Bonin. He had nearly 3,000 total flight hours, with approximately 800 of them on this aircraft type. At 22:29 local time, the Airbus lifted off. The takeoff was entirely routine, just as one would anticipate for a heavily loaded aircraft. The crew adhered to all standard protocols for their ascent and established their course for the transatlantic crossing. Following Air France's standard procedures, the relief first officer exited the cockpit to start his scheduled rest period. The captain then moved into the left seat, while the first officer remained in the right. A short time later, the flight leveled off at its cruising altitude, designated as Flight Level 350. The initial hours of the journey were largely unremarkable and proceeded without incident. At 1:35 a.m., the aircraft transitioned into oceanic airspace, high above the Atlantic Ocean to the northeast of the South American landmass. At this time of year, the Mid-Atlantic region is well known for its distinct weather phenomena, often defined by an extensive band of thunderstorms that form across the intertropical convergence zone. This zone is a belt of low pressure encircling the Earth, generally positioned near the equator. It's here that the trade winds from the northern and southern hemispheres converge, a phenomenon that frequently gives rise to thunderstorms and intense rainfall. Navigating this area often presents a considerable challenge for pilots, primarily because the thunderstorms do not render clearly on their radar systems. Furthermore, These weather systems generate significantly less lightning compared to storms in other parts of the world. This can create a deceptive appearance, making them seem less threatening than they actually are, a problem compounded by the darkness of night. While the aircraft's sophisticated automated systems were managing the flight, a core duty of the cockpit crew was to monitor the flight's trajectory, utilizing the onboard weather radar to steer clear of areas with significant turbulence. Air France Flight 447 soon entered a region of tropical showers and relatively weak thunderstorms, which were marked by light to moderate updrafts and a strong probability of turbulence. The pilots discussed their wish to climb to flight level 370, aiming to fly above the weather system. However, they determined that the air temperature at that altitude was too warm to permit the climb. Warmer air is less dense, which diminishes the amount of lift an aircraft's wings can produce, a critical factor for sustaining flight. The crew then lowered the intensity of the cockpit lighting and activated the landing lights to get a better view of the conditions outside. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the relief first officer came back from his rest. The captain then departed for his own break after an incomplete briefing. This lack of a clear division of roles would later contribute to confusion between the two remaining first officers. As a result, the first officer, Pierre-Cedric Bonin, was now the pilot flying from the right seat. While the captain officially remained the pilot in command, Bonin was at the controls, while the other first officer, David Robert, was monitoring instruments. He informed the relief first officer on their inability to ascend and the turbulent conditions they were expecting. 6 minutes later, the two first officers alerted the cabin crew about the imminent turbulence, which they expected to hit in about 2 minutes. The turbulence that followed proved to be of moderate intensity. Even with the autopilot active, the aircraft's bank angle oscillated between approximately 3 degrees to the right and 5 degrees to the left. The first officer increased the radar's gain setting to enhance its sensitivity and proposed a course adjustment to the left. They maneuvered the aircraft 12 degrees left of their planned route to navigate around the most severe weather. 2 minutes after that, the plane flew into an updraft. The pitot tubes began to ingest ice particles. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't pose a threat. However, if the density of these crystals is great enough, they can obstruct the tubes more quickly than the integrated heating elements can thaw them. The A330 is equipped with 3 pitot tubes, one for the captain's instruments, one for the first officers, and a third for the standby systems. Each pitot tube's function is to measure the pressure of the air flowing into it. This dynamic pressure is then contrasted with the static air pressure to calculate the plane's airspeed. That data is subsequently used to compute a variety of other critical flight parameters, including Mach number, vertical speed, and altitude, all of which are displayed in real time to the pilots. But if ice crystals block the pitot tubes, air can no longer flow in. This causes the measured pressure to fall, which in turn leads to a drop in the indicated airspeed. On Flight 447, as all 3 pitot tubes became saturated with ice, the airspeed readouts rapidly became unreliable, plummeting from approximately 275 down to 60 knots. This event set off a cascade of failures. The autopilot disengaged. The flight director bars vanished from the displays. The aircraft's flight control system switched from normal law to alternate law, a transition that deactivated numerous built-in safety features, including protections against high angles of attack, excessive speed, and extreme bank angles. Consequently, the aircraft became far more responsive to roll inputs from the pilots. "I have the controls." The aircraft immediately rolled to the right. The first officer took manual control, applying nose-up and left roll inputs. The auto-thrust system disengaged, and shortly after, the thrust levers were set to approximately 85% in one. The plane's pitch attitude climbed to 6 degrees, and its vertical speed surged past 1,800 feet per minute, which activated the stall warning. A stall occurs when an aircraft's wings are no longer able to generate sufficient lift. This loss of lift results in a sudden failure of the aircraft's capacity to remain airborne, leading it to descend or lose altitude abruptly. The first officer found it difficult to regain authority over the bank angle, overcorrecting the roll with inputs that were out of sync with the aircraft's motion. The stall alarm, however, continued for 54 seconds before it temporarily stopped, not because of stabilization, but because the airspeed readings became invalid. Only seconds later, the airspeed displayed on the standby instrument started to degrade again, falling precipitously. The aircraft's pitch steepened to 11 degrees, and its vertical speed shot past 6,000 feet per minute. The first officer persisted with nose-up commands, and the pitch attitude swelled to 16 degrees. A new series of minor roll motions started, and he countered each one with lateral inputs on his side stick. The stall warning blared once more. Amid the escalating crisis, the crew tried to summon the captain by activating a call chime in the crew rest compartment. The critical stall angle of attack was breached, making the aircraft shudder as it entered a state of aerodynamic instability. Engine thrust was advanced to the toga setting. The first officer maintained his nose-up inputs, which kept the aircraft in a tenuous, shallow climb. The rolling motion persisted, and the first officer's inputs intensified, using full left and right stick deflections to fight it. By now, the ice that had obstructed the pitot tubes had melted, and all three airspeed indicators were showing valid readings of approximately 180 knots. It was now painfully obvious that they were flying far too slowly for their altitude, where the normal airspeed should have been around 260 knots. Seconds later, the aircraft reached its peak altitude of nearly 38,000 feet. It had climbed roughly 3,000 feet since the autopilot disconnected. The bank angle steepened to the right. The first officer held his side stick fully to the left, but it had almost no impact on the bank. The relief first officer executed two full left control inputs. The first officer kept his own control stick held fully to the left and simultaneously pulled it completely back. The rate of descent swelled to 10,000 feet per minute. The pitch attitude wavered between 10 and 16 degrees nose up. 2 minutes after the autopilot had disconnected, the captain burst into the cockpit. The indicated airspeeds had now fallen below 60 knots, which rendered the angle of attack sensors invalid and, as a consequence, silenced the stall warning. As the speed readings dropped below 30 knots, a red SPD flag appeared in place of the airspeed display. Even with the first officer's side stick commanded fully to the left, the aircraft was banked sharply to the right, with angles fluctuating up to 45 degrees. The pitch attitude oscillated between 8 and 15 degrees nose up. The thrust levers were pulled to idle, and the nose dipped down. Each time the nose pitched down, the angle of attack decreased just enough for the airspeed indication to reappear and the stall warning to sound again. The aircraft's descent continued, with vertical speeds varying between 10,000 and 15,000 feet per minute. The thrust levers were advanced to the climb power setting, and for the first time in over a minute, the aircraft's wings briefly leveled out, suggesting a moment of straight flight. This, however, was fleeting, as the plane resumed its swaying motion from left to right, compelling the first officer to make large side-stick movements to counter each roll and try to stabilize the plane. As the aircraft passed through 20,000 feet, the thrust levers were pushed from the climb detent to toga. Shortly after, the aircraft started to roll right again. A full left side-stick command was applied and held continuously for 20 seconds. The relief first officer applied a left input, but the first officer never relinquished his own side-stick input. The relief first officer asked the captain to see if rebooting the flight control computers might help. The captain stated that it would be useless, but he reset both the primary and secondary flight control computers regardless. First officer: I've been at max nose up for a while. Captain: No, "No, no, don't climb. Go down." The relief first officer pushed his own stick forward. The first officer, however, persisted in pulling back, and a dual input alert sounded again. The relief first officer pushed the nose down to 7 degrees below the horizon. The airspeed indications and the stall warning reactivated. 7 seconds later, the first officer once again began pulling back on his side stick. The dual input warning was triggered, and the aircraft began to pitch up. The thrust levers were moved back to idle for 2 seconds, and the nose pitched up to 16 degrees. Seconds later, the ground proximity warning system's sync rate and pull-up alerts began to blare in the cockpit. At this point, the aircraft was in a deep stall, with an angle of attack exceeding 40 degrees and a vertical descent rate of around 10,000 feet per minute. The thrust levers were pushed to toga, and both pilots applied a nose-up command as the aircraft's pitch climbed back towards 16 degrees. At 2:14 Universal Time Coordinated, the aircraft collided with the ocean. All 228 people on board were lost. In a heartbreaking tragedy, the aircraft had fallen from 38,000 feet to the surface of the sea in just 3 minutes and 30 seconds, marking it as one of the most devastating days in the history of aviation. Let us take a moment to consider the profound weight of this event and remember all those who were lost before we proceed to the investigation. Shortly after 4 in the morning, when the flight did not make its scheduled contact with air traffic control in either Senegal or Cape Verde, the controller in Senegal tried to reach the aircraft. Despite repeated attempts, he received no reply. Brazil and Senegal then activated their rescue services, commencing the search for the missing aircraft. The difficulty, however, was immense. Air France Flight 447 had vanished in an area with no radar coverage, no conceivable witnesses, and unreliable radio communication. In the initial days of the search, the first floating wreckage and victims were found by Brazilian and French naval forces. The aircraft's vertical stabilizer was recovered a week after the crash. However, the final wreckage site of Flight 447 was ultimately located nearly 2 years later on April 3, 2011, at a depth of approximately 3,980 meters. By May 10, both of the aircraft's black boxes had been recovered and were dispatched for analysis by the BEA, France's Agency for Air Safety. In July of 2012, the BEA released its final report on the accident. The investigation revealed that a temporary inconsistency in the aircraft's measured speeds, most likely caused by the blockage of the pitot probes from ice crystals, had set the events in motion. As a consequence, the autopilot disconnected and the flight control system reverted to alternate law. This change disabled several key automated protections, including those for angle of attack, overspeed, and bank angle. This made the aircraft significantly more sensitive to manual roll inputs. According to the established procedure for such an event, the pilots were expected to quickly identify the problem and take corrective action with specific inputs for pitch attitude and thrust. However, the failure materialized without warning during the cruise phase of the flight, catching the pilots by complete surprise. This led to erratic and excessive roll inputs and a sharp, uncommanded nose-up maneuver. The aircraft entered a prolonged stall, which was clearly signaled by the stall warning and a strong physical buffeting. Yet, neither the audible stall warning nor the buffeting were correctly identified by the crew, even after the alarm had sounded continuously for 54 seconds. The crew never executed a stall recovery maneuver, which ultimately sealed their fate, leading to the impact with the ocean. The fact that they never attempted a recovery was likely a consequence of insufficient specific training, even though their training had complied with existing regulatory requirements. Manual control of an aircraft is not a skill that can be improvised. It demands precise and deliberate inputs on the flight controls. A review of their recent training records and check rides revealed that the co-pilots had not received training for manual aircraft handling and approach to stall and stall recovery scenarios at high altitudes. Based on the findings of the investigation, the BEA made a number of recommendations. These included a review of check and training programs to incorporate mandatory exercises focused on specific, regular drills for manual aircraft handling during stall approaches and recoveries, particularly at high altitude. Furthermore, it was recommended that aircraft engaged in public transport with passengers must be fitted with an image recorder capable of observing the entire instrument panel. Additionally, several other proposals were made, with suggestions for improving flight recorders, the design of pitot probes, better protocols for task sharing among augmented crews, and the installation of an angle of attack indicator in the cockpit. In the end, it is clear that no single theory can entirely account for the actions of the crew. In the meantime, it is valuable for everyone, even those who are not pilots, to think about the events of Air France Flight 447. Let us make it a priority to learn from the experiences of others, to guarantee safer skies for all. If you found this detailed analysis engaging, please consider showing your support by leaving a like, dropping a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to the channel for more content like this.